The night before the hanging came slow and heavy, like a breath held too long, and Elias Crow sat alone in the narrow wooden cell beneath the gallows, listening to the wind whisper through the ropes above as if the desert itself had gathered to hear his last truth, for he was a name carved deep into fear across the Wild West, a man spoken of in hushed voices by campfires and law officers alike, blamed for blood spilled on dusty roads and for towns left burning under the sun. Yet now, with his wrists free and no guard watching, he felt smaller than the legends that had grown around him, smaller than the shadow the gallows cast across the dirt floor, and as the moonlight slid through the bars and painted pale lines across his hands, he began to speak, not to anyone in the room, but to the night itself, to the ghosts that had followed him from one stolen horse to the next, confessing in a low, steady voice how the story everyone knew was only half true, how the first gun he ever held had been pressed into his palm by a man who wore a badge and smelled of whiskey, how fear had come before violence and love had come before loss, how he had not always been an outlaw but once a quiet boy named Eli who believed the land could be fair if you worked it honestly, until the drought took his family's farm and the law took his father for a crime he did not commit, and how that was the night something broke inside him, not loudly, but like dry wood splitting under pressure, slow and final, and he spoke of a woman named Mara with ash-brown hair and a laugh that came easy even in hard times, a woman who saw him not as a threat or a weapon but as a wounded man pretending to be dangerous, and how he had loved her in stolen moments between jobs, always promising her one last run, one final score that would buy them land far from the reach of men with guns and grudges, and how every promise had tasted like dust because he never kept them, not because he didn't want to, but because the world kept dragging him back into its teeth. And as the wind rattled the cell door he confessed that many of the killings tied to his name were not his doing, that he had arrived too late to stop some and too early to prevent others, that fear traveled faster than truth and towns needed a devil to blame, and he let them choose him because being hated was easier than being hunted by his own memories, and he spoke of the night Mara died, not by a bullet from a rival gang as the stories claimed, but by a stray shot fired by a trembling young deputy who panicked when he saw Elias step from the shadows with empty hands raised, and how Elias had held her as the life left her eyes while the deputy ran and the truth scattered like birds into the dark, and how that was the moment Elias Crow stopped running toward something and began running from everything, wearing the outlaw name like armor, letting it harden him until even he almost believed it, and as his voice grew rough with memory he admitted that the last robbery, the one that sealed his fate, had been done not for greed but for a letter he had stolen from the sheriff's office, a letter that proved his father's innocence and named the real men who had framed him, men long dead now, and how he had planned to trade that letter for a chance to leave quietly, but the trade turned into gunfire, and once again the legend swallowed the man whole, and now here he was, sitting beneath the rope that would end it all. Finally telling the truth to the dark because it was the only thing left that felt honest, and as the hours crept forward and the cold deepened, Elias spoke softer, confessing not just his past but his regrets, the children he never had, the mornings he never woke beside Mara, the quiet life that slipped through his fingers like sand, and he wondered aloud if truth mattered when no one was left to hear it, if a confession made to the wind could change anything, yet still he spoke, because somewhere deep inside he hoped the land itself might remember him differently, not as a monster, but as a man shaped by loss and bad choices made too young. And when his voice finally faded and silence returned, the gallows above creaked gently as if answering him, and Elias Crow leaned back against the cold stone wall, eyes closed, breathing slow, having given the night everything he had left, unaware that his words, carried by the wind beyond the jailhouse walls, were already beginning to stir something dangerous and unexpected in the sleeping town beyond, something that might arrive with the dawn and force the truth into the light whether the legend was ready or not. They called her the widow of Red Mesa long before she ever earned the name herself, whispered it in saloons and muttered it behind hands as if speaking too loudly might summon death, and when Eliza Boone rode into the desert town of Calder's Reach beneath the cruel white sun, dressed in black that looked too clean for mourning and too heavy for the heat, every man who saw her felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with fear. For stories traveled faster than wagons in the West and hers had arrived weeks ahead of her, tales of outlaws who had loved her and died soon after, one shot in an alley, another hanged from a cottonwood, another cut down in a canyon ambush, and whether she was cursed or simply unlucky no one could say, but men agreed on one thing, they would not be the next to test fate, and so they watched her from a distance as she purchased a small adobe house on the edge of town where the red cliffs caught fire at sunset, watched as she walked alone to the well and back, her posture straight, her eyes calm but distant, and though she never spoke of her past, grief clung to her like the dust on her boots, a quiet, heavy grief that had settled so deep it no longer showed itself in tears. And Eliza did not come to Calder's Reach looking for love or trouble or redemption. She came because the land was wide and empty, and she believed, foolishly, perhaps, that space might finally loosen the ache inside her, that a place where no one knew her real name might let her breathe again. But the desert had a way of bringing buried things to the surface, and one evening as the sun bled into the horizon and the wind carried the smell of iron and sage, Eliza heard a sound at her door that froze her where she stood, a dull thud followed by a rough breath, and when she opened it she found a man collapsed against the frame, blood darkening his shirt, his revolver fallen into the dirt, his face pale but familiar in the way danger often was, for she had seen his likeness on wanted posters nailed to courthouse walls across 3 territories. Jonah Pike, the gunslinger who never missed, the man rumored to have killed for less than a hard look, and for a moment Eliza considered closing the door and letting the legend bleed out beneath the stars, because she knew better than anyone what loving men like him led to. Yet as she knelt beside him and saw not the outlaw but the pain, the fear flickering behind his closed eyes, something inside her shifted, not hope, not desire, but recognition, and she dragged him inside with more strength than she thought she had, cleaned his wound with shaking hands, and sat by his side through the night listening to his breath catch and steady, wondering if fate had found her again or if this was simply the consequence of living too close to the edge of things. And when Jonah finally woke he reached for his gun before realizing where he was, his eyes meeting hers with surprise and something like shame, and he tried to sit up only to wince, and Eliza told him calmly to lie still, that he had been shot and was lucky the bullet passed clean, and Jonah studied her face as if trying to place her, his voice low when he said he would leave as soon as he could stand, because trouble followed him and he did not wish to bring it to her door. And Eliza felt a bitter smile touch her lips at that, because trouble had been knocking on her door her whole life, yet she said nothing of her reputation, nothing of the dead men tied to her name. And days passed with Jonah recovering under her roof, the town watching from a distance as rumors grew sharper and eyes more suspicious, and though Eliza kept her distance, speaking only when needed, Jonah noticed the careful way she moved, the quiet sadness she carried, and he began to speak to fill the silence, telling her pieces of his life without ever naming his crimes, telling her of places he had seen and people he had lost, and Eliza listened, finding herself drawn not to his danger but to the softness he tried so hard to hide, the way he looked at the horizon as if searching for something he had misplaced long ago, and she told him little of herself, only that she had buried more than she cared to remember, and when he asked why she lived alone she said the land was easier company than people, and for the first time in years she laughed, a small sound that surprised them both, and Jonah felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with his wound, because he knew men like him did not get second chances, and women like her did not survive loving men like him. Yet as he healed and the days stretched long and quiet, a fragile closeness grew between them, built from shared glances and unspoken understanding, from evenings spent watching the sun sink behind Red Mesa, the sky burning like the past neither of them could escape, and Eliza began to feel the dangerous stirring of hope, the kind she had sworn never to allow again, because she knew how it ended, she knew the sound of gunfire in the night, the weight of a body gone still in her arms, and she began to pull away, her words growing shorter, her eyes more guarded, until one night Jonah asked her why she looked at him as if she were already saying goodbye, and the question cracked something open inside her, and she finally told him the truth, not the rumors, but the fear beneath them, that every man she had loved had died violently, that she did not believe herself cursed but she believed in patterns, and that she could not bear to watch another man bleed out because of her heart, and Jonah listened without interrupting, his face unreadable, and when she finished he said quietly that men like him did not need curses to die young, that the life he lived carried its own sentence, and that if fate wanted him it would not need her help, and Eliza turned away, tears burning her eyes, because she knew he was right and still it changed nothing. And the next morning Jonah announced he was leaving, his strength returned enough to ride, and the town exhaled as word spread, men nodding with grim satisfaction, believing the widow of Red Mesa had been spared another tragedy, and Eliza stood in her doorway watching Jonah saddle his horse, her chest aching with words she refused to speak, and Jonah hesitated, looking back at her as if memorizing the shape of her in the morning light, and he said only thank you, not for saving his life but for reminding him what it felt like to be seen as more than a gun, and as he rode away, dust rising behind him, Eliza closed the door and leaned against it, the silence crushing, convinced she had done the right thing even as her heart broke all over again, unaware that the past was not finished with either of them, that men Jonah had crossed were already tracking him, and that fate, cruel and patient, was tightening its grip, preparing to test whether love could survive the kind of violence the West demanded, or whether the legend of the widow of Red Mesa would claim one more name before the sun set on their unfinished story. Deadwood Crossing looked like a town that had already given up on tomorrow, its buildings leaning at tired angles, its streets scarred by wagon ruts and old blood, and when Thomas Hale rode in beneath a low, bruised sky, no one reached for a welcome or a warning, because Deadwood Crossing had not seen real law in years and had learned the hard way that badges came and went but graves stayed full, and Thomas knew that look well, the way men glanced at his horse first, then at the star pinned to his coat as if measuring how long it would last before ending up buried with him, and he felt the familiar weight of the badge pull at his chest like an accusation, because it was not a thing he wanted to wear again, not after the last time, not after the night the law had failed so badly it had taken everything from him, yet here he was all the same, riding into a town held together by fear and habit, because sometimes a man did not choose the road ahead so much as he followed it because there was nowhere else left to go, and as Thomas dismounted near the empty sheriff's office, he took in the signs of a place waiting to break, the windows boarded but not repaired, the saloon doors hanging loose, the absence of children's voices or church bells, and he knew before anyone spoke that Deadwood Crossing was ruled not by a single outlaw but by an understanding, a quiet agreement that violence was easier than hope, and the men who benefited from that understanding would not welcome him, and the men who suffered under it would not believe in him until it was too late, and Thomas could not blame them, because belief was a dangerous thing in a place like this, and as he stepped inside the sheriff's office, dust rising around his boots, he found a desk with a bullet hole through it and a cell with a broken lock, and on the wall, carved deep into the wood, were the names of men who had once tried to hold the line and failed, and Thomas rested a hand against the wall, closing his eyes briefly as memories rose uninvited, the smell of smoke, the sound of screaming, the way his hands had shaken when he realized he was too late, always too late, and he thought of the town he had once sworn to protect, the one that burned while he lay wounded miles away, the one where his wife and son had waited for him until waiting turned into dying, and it was that failure that had driven him from the badge, that had turned him into a drifting gun for hire who refused promotions and avoided towns that needed saving, until Deadwood Crossing, of all places, had found him, because a man with nothing left was sometimes the only kind willing to stand where everyone else stepped aside, and word spread quickly that a marshal had arrived, men gathering in doorways and shadows, watching him with the careful eyes of people who had learned to expect disappointment, and Thomas made no speeches, offered no promises, he simply posted the law, what little of it there was left to post, and began doing small things that mattered, breaking up a drunken beating, forcing a crooked shop owner to reopen his doors to those he had been cheating, and each small act stirred the waters just enough to draw attention, and by the second night, the men who truly ran Deadwood Crossing took notice, sending a message in the form of a body left in the street, a young ranch hand beaten and shot for the crime of believing the marshal might make a difference, and Thomas stood over the body as the sun rose, anger burning low and steady in his chest, because he knew this was the test, the moment when a town decided whether to retreat further into itself or stand, and as he arranged the burial himself, no one else willing to risk it, he felt the eyes of the town on him, measuring not his courage but his resolve, waiting to see if this badge would break like the others, and that night, as Thomas sat alone in the office cleaning his rifle, the ghosts returned in full force, his wife's voice asking why he had been gone so long, his son's laughter cutting off too soon, and he admitted to the empty room what he had never said aloud, that he was afraid, not of dying, but of surviving another failure, of living through the loss of people who trusted him again, and when the knock came at the door he nearly reached for his gun before opening it to find a handful of townsfolk standing there, nervous and determined, a shopkeeper, a preacher, a woman with hard eyes who ran the boarding house, and they did not ask him to save them, they asked him what they could do to help, and something shifted then, something fragile and powerful, because Deadwood Crossing had not asked that question in years, and Thomas told them the truth, that there would be violence before there was peace, that some of them might not live to see the end of it, and the woman said quietly that some of them were already dying anyway, just slower, and so they began to prepare, hiding families, reinforcing buildings, spreading word to nearby ranches, and as the days passed, the tension grew thick enough to taste, until finally the men who ruled from the shadows rode in openly, a small army led by a man Thomas recognized at once, Cole Vanner, the same outlaw who had led the raid on Thomas's old town years ago, the same man whose grin he had seen in his nightmares, and when their eyes met across the street, Thomas felt the past crash into the present with brutal force, because here was the ghost made flesh, the reckoning he had never escaped, and Vanna smiled as if greeting an old friend, calling out that he had heard Deadwood Crossing had found itself a hero, and Thomas said nothing, because there were no words left between them, only history and what came next, and the standoff did not last long, because men like Vanna did not wait for permission, and gunfire tore through the street, shattering windows and lives alike, and Thomas moved with the grim efficiency of a man who had lost the luxury of hesitation, barking orders, returning fire, pulling wounded townsfolk to safety, and in the chaos he felt strangely calm, because this was the moment he had been running from and toward all at once, the chance to stand his ground even if it cost him everything, and as the fight raged, Thomas confronted Vanna in the street, dust and smoke swirling around them, and Vanna taunted him with the past, with the names of the dead, with the reminder that Thomas could not save everyone, and Thomas answered not with anger but with truth, that he knew that now, that he had always known, and that it did not excuse doing nothing, and when the shooting stopped and Vanna lay dead in the dirt, the silence that followed was heavy and stunned, broken only by the wind moving through Deadwood Crossing like a breath finally released, and when the sun rose the next morning, the town was changed, not healed, not whole, but standing, and Thomas sat on the steps of the sheriff's office, blood on his coat, hands shaking at last, knowing the cost had been high and the future uncertain, but also knowing that for the first time since his failure, he had faced the ghosts and not turned away, and as the townsfolk began to gather, quieter now, steadier, Thomas Hale understood that being the last marshal was not about wearing the badge forever, but about holding the line long enough for others to believe it could exist at all, and whether Deadwood Crossing would remember him as a hero or simply as the man who stood when it mattered, he did not know, but as the light touched the battered buildings and the town stirred awake, he allowed himself one small, hard-earned belief, that even in a place as broken as this, law and hope could still take root, watered by sacrifice, and guarded by those willing to face the past head-on, no matter the cost. Black Canyon was a wound cut deep into the earth, a place where the sun seemed to hesitate before reaching the bottom and shadows clung long after dusk, and everyone west of the Colorado line knew its name and the warning that followed it, because gold had been found there once, bright, heavy, enough to make men dream, but none who chased it ever came back whole. And so when Samuel Crow stumbled into the desert town of Piedra Roja clutching a cracked leather map with shaking hands and hollow eyes, the old men on the porch knew trouble had arrived before he ever spoke a word, for Samuel was not a hardened outlaw or a fearless adventurer. He was a tired prospector worn thin by years of bad luck, a widower who had buried his wife beneath a cottonwood and his hope beneath failed claims, and when he laid the map on the saloon table with reverence bordering on fear, whispering that it showed the true vein hidden deep in Black Canyon, the room fell quiet, because some legends were better left sleeping, and Samuel told them he had not stolen the map nor bought it, that it had been pressed into his hands by a dying stranger who smelled of sulfur and dust, a man who laughed as he bled and said the devil always collected his debts, and though the men laughed nervously and told Samuel he was chasing ghosts, none missed the way the lantern light flickered when he spoke, or the way the air seemed to tighten around the map itself, and that night, as Samuel lay alone in a rented room, he heard the first whisper, soft as breath against his ear, promising relief from hunger and grief, promising enough gold to bury the past and buy a future, and though he told himself it was only the wind, the whisper spoke his name, and by morning he was already riding toward Black Canyon, driven by desperation stronger than fear, and the desert seemed to watch him go, the rocks like teeth, the sky vast and indifferent, and with every mile the whispers grew clearer, sometimes gentle, sometimes sharp, urging him onward, reminding him of the cold nights he had gone hungry, the towns that had laughed him out, the way his wife had coughed herself to death while he promised her things he could never give, and when he reached the canyon's edge at dusk, Samuel felt a weight press against his chest, the sense of stepping onto ground that remembered blood, and the canyon welcomed him with silence broken only by the distant cry of a hawk, and as he descended the narrow path marked on the map, shadows twisted along the walls, forming shapes that looked too much like watching faces, and he told himself again it was only the light, only exhaustion, until he reached a narrow shelf where old tools lay half buried in dust, pickaxes rusted, bones scattered among them, and the whispers laughed softly then, no longer hiding, and Samuel dropped to his knees, shaking, yet when he struck the rock where the map marked the vein, the sound changed, ringing deep and true, and gold gleamed back at him, thick and rich beyond anything he had ever seen, and all washed over fear, because in that moment all the suffering felt worth it, all the warnings foolish, and he worked until his hands bled, filling his sack as the whispers praised him, calling him clever, chosen. And when night fell the canyon grew unnaturally still, stars hidden, the air heavy with heat, and Samuel realized too late that he was no longer alone, shapes moving at the edge of the light, not solid, not whole, figures that wore the outlines of men long dead, their eyes glowing with hunger, and the whispers told him the truth at last, that the gold was cursed not by magic but by desire, that Black Canyon fed on men who loved gold more than life, and that every ounce taken required payment, not in coin but in flesh, and Samuel tried to run, dropping the sack, but the canyon twisted, paths shifting, walls closing in, and the voices turned cruel, reminding him that he had chosen this, that desperation was the door the devil used, and as he stumbled deeper, he saw visions of the past, men striking gold and striking each other, brothers killing brothers, partners burying partners beneath shallow graves, the canyon drinking their last breaths and remembering them forever. And Samuel fell beside an old fire pit where the bones were piled highest, understanding then that the map had never been an escape but an invitation, and he screamed for forgiveness, for his wife, for God, but Black Canyon answered only with echoes, and when dawn came the next day, a search party from Piedra Roja found the canyon quiet and unchanged, the gold vein hidden once more, and at the canyon's edge they discovered Samuel's sack of gold resting neatly beside the path, untouched, too heavy with promise, and no sign of Samuel himself. Beyond a single boot and a trail that ended abruptly at bare stone, and the old men did not argue this time, they burned the map without reading it, scattered the ashes to the wind, and swore never to speak of it again. Yet sometimes, on certain nights when the desert lies too still and the stars refuse to shine, travelers passing near Black Canyon swear they hear whispers riding the wind, soft and tempting, offering wealth beyond measure to anyone willing to listen, because the devil's gold is patient, and the West is full of desperate souls, and Black Canyon remembers them all.